on my case about it. Okay, thanks. All right. And another big shout out to all of you, because this community is, I think, very important to Habitat and to shaping the direction in which it will go. And so that's why I really thought it was important for us to talk about it here. Shout out to our partners. It's nice to have some of our partners from Affinity and Razorfish and so forth here tonight as well. But it's really all about you. It's about us, the Sitecore community. And just really thank you. You guys are awesome. And we really want to make sure, I really want to make sure that you guys get involved in this talk about Habitat today. So please, as we go through, recognize that I want you to speak up a little bit. I hope this is more of a discussion about, somebody called me when we came in, I think Mr. Sitecore, you said, and so I'm Mr. Habitat, and I'm not Mr. Habitat. I think Thomas is Mr. Habitat. I'm somebody who's, we've done implementation with Habitat, and hopefully some of you who've done some implementations with Habitat, Ben from Razorfish is here, you'll share some of his experience a little bit later. We want to hear from you about that. And I also want to hear about you from your concerns about what you see here today. And Thomas, who's on the line, is going to hear a little bit of that as well. So that's going to be some good feedback that goes back up the line. So speak up if you have questions and concerns during this session. It's interactive. Do offer your questions and comments. And by all means, let's keep it real, and we want to try to keep it on the experience level. You know, what we've done and what are the practical impacts. What are your objections and concerns? Let's hear them. Let's get going. So it's Habitat in the trenches. We're going to cover a few things really quickly. What Sitecore Habitat is, what's in the box. I'll flip through some of the resources that are available, what you get when you download the Habitat project. We'll have a little bit of a look at the project itself and to understand the architecture, but we're not going to go too deeply into it. We'll have just a technical overview of what's in there from an architectural standpoint to understand that. After that, we'll talk about what Habitat is not. And when I asked Thomas what he wanted to, if he wanted to share anything, he said that was probably an important thing to share with people, was what Habitat was not. So we'll take a look at that as well. Why it matters, why should I care about Habitat at this point? And then we'll have an in the trenches discussion. That's when I'm really looking for your feedback and to hear your experience, questions, and concerns. And we'll discuss the future of Habitat very briefly and what we think, where it should go and where it's going. Online resources are there as well. Now, what is Sitecore Habitat? Well, Sitecore Habitat is, as Thomas has put it, I'm going to just close this here, a modular architecture focused on streamlining example. And that's actually a really important word for me not to miss. A modular architecture example focused on streamlining the Sitecore development process and optimizing long-term projects. It's a framework, and it's an architectural example in the terms that it's an implementation example. That's why they've given an example of implementation. But it's also the architectural framework, as well as process. I think all of those highlighted words are pretty important in this context. It also suggests certain processes and certain methodologies that we can adopt. And the whole point of it is to make Sitecore implementations and Sitecore projects a little bit easier to maintain, a little bit easier to change, to help developers and teams be a little bit more productive. And I think it's something, honestly, that's been quite a long time coming. One of the reasons why that modularity or that architecture design for change is so important, I think, is because web content management is really all about change. People buy CMSs because they want to be able to change their websites. And there's somewhat of a tension with that and what we do as developers and project managers, especially in terms of managing change and sometimes being a little bit afraid of them changing things. You know, they go off and get a great idea, and all of a sudden we have to change the structure, and there's a lot of impacts and dependencies, and we have problems. So WCMS systems have to be designed for change. Our solutions have to be change ready. They have to be kind of future-proof solutions. And we're addressing this problem here right now that as we have more and more change, the cost for our implementations goes up. So that's what it's really all about. It's about addressing that challenge and decoupling parts of the system so that they become easier to manage and change over time. And it's really that kind of coupling that makes Sitecore implementations so hard. The next few slides I'll credit Thomas with as well. They're out of his very excellent Habitat presentations, and I think he'll probably be doing some pretty soon in some of the upcoming events. I would look out for those. Those are very important. So it is, of course, when we develop systems, we have a lot of dependencies between different parts of the systems. And in a complex systems, there's a lot of complex dependencies between all of the parts. As the system grows in complexity, of course, all of those dependencies grow. And it becomes a little bit more difficult when you have to consider, what am I going to do when a customer asks for a change to this module? How are we going to manage that? Were we ready when we started? And I can say that quite often the answer is no, we're not ready for that. So what Habitat does is it focuses on decoupling the dependencies between the elements of our system, architecturally speaking. What that helps us to do is to take our modules and to make them less dependent on each other. That means now if I have to change one aspect of a module, it becomes a little bit less of a problem, right? I have fewer dependencies on other elements, and the cost of change is a little bit lower. Principles that govern Habitat, and again from Thomas: simplicity, a consistent architecture, flexibility to be able to quickly to change things without having to worry about how they affect other parts of the system, to be able to extend certain modules, to add the capabilities to them without having a steep learning curve. So if somebody comes in, they know what's going on, they can find things, it's discoverable, and the systems are flexible. So these are the principles that really govern it. Questions on just those guiding principles or comments, anything that you want to say? And I keep going. Like I said, I've got a lot to get through. Another one of the challenges that when Thomas was talking about Habitat was, again, that, and I'll name drop quite a bit because he is the master of Habitat, but is really to decide what to talk about when we talk about. There's so much in the box. We'll only scratch the surface here. I'd really encourage you to go and to crack the box open yourself and have a look around because there is a lot in the box. But let's talk about what is in there right now. So with Habitat, you get if you go to the habitat.sitecore.net, I've got some of these sites open here already. There is a sample implementation right there. You'll find a package that you can download. Oh, it's cool. It's good. It adjusted on it. Okay. You'll find a package that you can download there, and you install that on top of Sitecore 8 and publish, and you're ready to go. You have a Habitat instance. Poke around in there, but you'll need a little bit more than that. As well as that, there's an open source sample code that's available on GitHub. I'll have all of these at the end of the presentation, and we'll post it on our site later on. So there is a GitHub repository with a Habitat source code. There is a version there if you're using Unicorn or for serialization or TDS. There's versions for both. The Unicorn one's a little bit, the main branch is a little bit more up to date. The TDS one is maintained by Hedgehog, so they have to go through and update it every once in a while. But it's a trivial matter for you to download the one and then just to kind of unserialize items and reserialize them in your TDS one to catch up. So that's there for you as well. The sample code and the Visual Studio project. Now, let me grab my water because I'm going to get that. Visual Studio project is also available via those same links of the GitHub repository. I'm going to crack it open just very briefly, and we're going to take a quick flip through so you can see what you actually get when you open it up. This is the Unicorn-based one. If there's any questions or comments on the text, you can say so as well, Nabil. So when you open up the Habitat solution, you'll see a configuration node. And one of the first things that you'll find odd, if you were like me, is what is this gulp stuff? what is all of these? These are not things I'm used to using. Who uses tools like Gulp? Who has used tools like Gulp? Very popular in the Java world, and a lot of front-end devs of all stripes use it. Not something that a lot of us have been using in the community, but they've been using it for kind of just some of that builds, scripting, and doing tasks and things in there. Some configuration that you'll have to do just to get the projects going. All of that is there, and there's a pretty good, quick README that's included in the file. And of course, on the wiki as well, on the GitHub repository. This wiki is a quick start getting started. Leads you through all the things you need to know in terms of getting familiar with that sort of configuration. So nothing to fear, and actually introduced me to a lot of tools that I wasn't previously using, but I think are pretty useful. So really great opportunity to get exposed to technologies you might not have used a lot of in the past, and see how they really can fit into a Sitecore project. The other thing that you'll note is these 3 other folders. These 3 folders represent some levels of the Habitat architecture, and this is where it starts to become a little bit different than what we might have done in the past. And before I get right into that, I'm actually going to switch right over. So this is kind of highlighting the architecture of that project and what you've seen here. There's in Habitat, in each of the Habitat, in a Habitat project, there is a project layer. That project layer is all the stuff that your website-specific items go into. Things like your main layout, things like the CSS for this particular styling of your website. So your sites go into that. And in the sample Habitat implementation, there are 3 sites. It's already configured for multi-site. So you'll see 3 main sites. One is the Habitat site. That's the site you see when you install Habitat. You'll get that's the Habitat local site, which I have on my machine. You can look at later when we have a chance to chat. There's a demo site, and I'm not really too sure what they're using that for. It seems to be kind of a little bit of a waste of space, but I don't use it so much. And some common items and stuff. There is in Habitat as well this feature layer. So features include things are functional bits. So instead of what I found when I started some Sitecore development years ago, and still find in a lot of projects, you'll often find just one big, all the features, all of the components, all of the sub-layouts, everything that you're doing in the website in one big website project, right? It's the Sitecore website project, put everything in there, they'll organize it with folders. What Habitat is doing for modularity is actually putting all of those functional bits into separate projects known as features. And they're grouped functionally, they're grouped by the types of data they consume, the data models that they would work with. So you'll find things like accounts. So that'll be like in the Habitat sample implementation, that's like the account management, logging in, registering, identity management, language, the language switcher on your site, media, how do you handle things like rotators, and so all of your rotators and video libraries and all those sorts of things might go into a media project, because those are all related. And they'll have similar architectures and similar metadata. They'll deal with pictures and videos and all those sorts of things. So all of these things are grouped together in features. The foundation level, you'll find different assets. It'll deal with things like the indexing, installation, the multi-site configuration, serialization, whether it be Unicorn or TDS, whatever you choose to use, Sitecore extensions, so all of your other sorts of helpers and so forth that go on that level. And of course, because they're all in separate projects, you might choose to use any of these elements for a new project. And because they're separated one from another, when you have something like a news list in your news feature perhaps, and you theoretically, if you architect it correctly, that news list on the front end just has some semantic HTML, it has all the business logic and everything else, but all of the styling, all of the really fancy stuff that you want to do, your UX guy comes up with, it lives in the project level. So you could take that news list and reuse it. And that really has great value, especially for us as partners who are working on really, we're working on some really cool bits, and we want to make sure it's going to fit into the next, and just be able to reuse that stuff, build a bit of a library ourselves. That reusability is built in because of that separation of concerns there. Of course, on the framework level, we're talking stuff those are the things you install. Sitecore 8, MVC, Bootstrap, Unicorn, SAS, XUnit for testing, all of those elements on the framework level. And it doesn't mean necessarily that you're married to any of those things, but those are provided for you so you get an idea. This will go back really quick. So I'll just flip through again, show you in the Visual Studio project. Things like the accounts. And each of these features, you will find your traditional code project where you'll have all of your things like your code behind, your markup, your semantic HTML, all of those things right there. Any configuration that you might need for the feature. A feature is all self-contained. So that means everything I should need for that piece of functionality to work is included in that project. You'll also find if you're using a TDS version, you'll find a TDS project in there. We'll have the Sitecore items as well. And oftentimes you will find a test project. So there's unit tests, and testability is built into the recommendations, built into the sample implementation as well. So we're getting some really clear messages from Sitecore about how they're thinking we should be implementing these things here. So you're not only getting those projects, but as you can see from the architecture, you're getting a ready to go best practices sort of architecture as well. And that includes also a lot of different technologies. Certainly, Habitat is MVC. I think the ship has sailed on that. It seems everything everybody's doing right now has been MVC. So get on that train before it leaves, because I think it has already left the station. So if you're not doing MVC and Sitecore, get on it, or you will be left behind most definitely, I think. SaaS, we mentioned a lot of these. I'm just going to flip through some of the technical pieces that Habitat does include. One thing that was notable from absence by my developers was Glass Mapper. Who uses Glass Mapper right now? Yes. So okay. So you guys may miss it. We missed it a little bit. Some of the devs missed it a bit, but they've gotten rid of that. And in Habitat, it doesn't mean you can't use it. It doesn't mean that you have to be committed to this, to that particular bit. But they're doing things in a different way. In each project in Habitat, there is a templates class which contains a whole bunch of, and I will show you actually one right here in the accounts feature, which includes a bunch of IDs, names and IDs for actual fields in the feature. So the stuff that you put in your TDS project, all of those IDs go in there, their names, and they can be referenced, by name via this class with all of these static references. Now, as you can see, what that really means is they're requiring you in this architecture to do a lot more kind of hand coding. You're not just counting on Glass to map the objects for you and update everything for you. In that true kind of MVC, kind of more simple handcrafted code kind of model, we're made to address it and to deal with it in this way. That has its minuses, yes, in terms of us getting used to it. But we found in practice, it actually has a lot of pluses too. I mean, developers have to be a lot more careful about how they're actually building these things out. So that's going to be an interesting thing to see how that pans out. But if you like Glass, you can still use it. It's not going to stop you from using it. And of course, there are, as a recommendation in Habitat, to reduce the coupling between different modules, to think of using things like inversion. So there's the visual control in that. So it hasn't specified an IOC container, and first of all, who's using, what IOC containers are you guys using right now? Anybody want to offer? You guys are using Unity as well, yeah? Sorry? And I think that's pretty much going to be what it's right across, especially Castle with a lot of the Sitecore stuff built right into them. And of course, Chris, you'll know that we did a lot of that as well. So in the box, yes, the best practices, yes, the architecture, the technical foundation as we just went through is there. And lastly, I think is some confidence. It's some confidence in that the architecture that you've chosen is something that's coming from Sitecore. I hope that means it's going to be around for a while, that it's not just a fly-by-night thing. Hopefully also that it's some confidence, with your clients, that we are not just inventing, and everybody has these old great ideas in their head, not just inventing an architecture to suit your needs, but this is something that has gone through the community and some best practice and some vetting. And, really I can then offer that to my clients with a little bit more confidence. So I think that's something that's important not to ignore, that it also does offer confidence as well as all of those other things. What Habitat is not, and I'm going to read a message from Thomas here, that there's some general confusion about what Habitat is in the community. And from our experience, I think the most important point is to separate Habitat, the Habitat architecture and principles, which are implemented in any project with your preferred tools and frameworks, and the Habitat implementation, which is meant to be an example of an architecture, not a starter kit or a supported code base. We're working frantically on the documentation, on documenting the architecture better, and the principles will be backed more and more by the tools and frameworks we bring out in the future. So it is not, it's not at all a ready-to-go kind of, accelerator. Some people do accelerators. Non-linear is doing some accelerators as well. But it's not taking over that place. It's not taking over that spot in the marketplace. It's not going to, you're not going to just plug in Habitat and have a site that's ready. But it's really guidance for you and providing you a practical code base. Some of those things that are already built are great, and we can start using those. But there is some assembly required. So Habitat is not a starter kit, not supported by Sitecore, as Thomas said, as a code base. And it's not a religion. I want to say that as well, because we talked about all of those technologies, and later on I'll just mention very briefly Agile. I remember when I went to one client and mentioned Agile, we had a bit of almost a religious war about the thing. Well, Habitat is not a new religion, so you don't have to be all in on all of the aspects. Take what you need from it, offer what you can to it. We're contributing to it together. It's not something that's been forced down on high. It's an endeavor that we think we should all be contributing to. I think if there was to be a movie about what Sitecore development was like back in the day, I probably would call it this. That's exactly what it was like. I think that's probably myself, Amanda, or somebody else. Anyway, Nabil. Why does Habitat really matter now? Because of that past. When I started Sitecore development, if you opened up a project and you went to a new place for a new project, God knows what you would find in terms of how the content sheet was set up. Any number of a million wrong ways. How were things architected in the project? How did they do integration? It was all over the place. And so why I think it's important is because it's going to bring some consistency to the Sitecore community. I think it's important for you right now because now's the chance while this stuff is getting developed for us to let Thomas and company know what we think. Hallelujah. And it's going to help us to, and this is good for our clients too, to help us to build future-proof solutions. I think this is very important. Important as part of the maturity of our community, because if we don't have best practices, we're not really a mature technical community yet, and we haven't had those as of yet. And this is the first time we've had it. So I think it's important for us now because of that as well. Certainly, it offers value to our customers. A technology that doesn't somehow bring a bottom line value to your customers is just a fun, geeky game that you're playing, right? But I think this really does bring value to your customers, and we have to be able to articulate that value in terms of future-proofing them, in terms of best practices, in terms of a lot of different things, and I'll get into a couple of those with the few minutes that we have left. Creates a better experience for you and I, especially as well. And it's more than architecture. Habitat influences everything that we do in terms of our development lifecycle for Sitecore. We've got about 15 minutes, and I'm hoping right here that we're going to have a little bit more of an interactive session. And to get the juices going, one of our partners has been very kind to come, and he's going to offer a little bit of his experience. So I'm going to introduce to you Ben Switzer. He's from Razorfish, Director of Technology. So let's just give Ben a little hand. And I'll stay here with Ben a little bit.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dennis.
There we go. And we're going to start off by just talking about some of the areas that really Habitat affects. And Ben has had some experience. Let him tell you about that. We're going to touch first, I think, on DevOps and continuous integration and the like, and Ben's experience on that.
Thank you, Dennis. So as Dennis has indicated, the practice of building your solution with Habitat is potentially different in that Habitat provides Gulp as a mechanism to do your build. There's a Gulp script as part of the solution that has several tasks. Those tasks can be used for things like copying your Sitecore libraries into your project for dependencies and compilation, NuGet restore, so tasks that help you get up to speed. A new developer come in and get up to speed quickly. It can also be used to build and publish and also synchronize your Sitecore items. So for the project we worked on with TechGuilds, we decided to move forward with Habitat. We were excited for an opportunity to learn Habitat, but also we're kind of driven by the points that Dennis highlighted in that. We wanted a solution that is more future-proof, that Sitecore potentially support can provide some guidance. So for example, this client is going to manage the solution moving forward themselves, and having the solution architected in such a way that someone else can come in and quickly identify issues down the road if they should arise was a benefit for us. We found that with the continuous integration specifically, the Gulp script and the changes around that threw us for a bit of a loop in that the developers that were on the project were not familiar with Gulp, so there was a learning curve there. They're used to using Visual Studio and the tools built in, being able to build and deploy right from Visual Studio. So having to use Gulp either in the task runner in Visual Studio or the command line was a bit of a change. And some of the other issues that we ran once we started to try to automate the builds was around having Gulp iterate through all the projects. So the default script basically iterates through all the source folders looking for project files, as opposed to building the solution as a whole from the solution file. So without close observation or kind of making sure that developers were not checking in code that wasn't ready, builds were being done that incorporated project files that weren't ready for testing, for example. So builds were breaking all over the place. The practice of simply not including your project in the solution file was a practice that couldn't be practiced moving forward. The other issue we encountered in setting up the CI build was around Jenkins. So we are more of a Java and Scala shop than we are Microsoft. Sitecore is fairly new practice for us. So we thought we'd throw Jenkins at the build problem. We found quickly that Jenkins, although it's Java-based and can run on Windows, is not the ideal tool set for that. So we're actually starting a new project, and we'll be looking at Team City for that. But specifically around Jenkins, the fact that with Jenkins we found the only way to run the build properly was with a command script. So you're executing your build script within a command .exe or command prompt, which in turn was triggering NS build from within a Gulp plugin. So there was kind of 3 layers to actually execute the build, and issues that were occurring during compilation or synchronization of Sitecore items was not immediately available. All that log information wasn't bubbling up back to Jenkins. So Jenkins was actually reporting that the build was successful, but in reality, there was all kinds of issues going on underneath it. You'd have to then go dig and figure out. So some hard lessons learned, but I think some valuable ones for us. For the future, I indicated that we're looking at Team City, and we might actually not use Gulp as part of that continuous integration process. So I think it's a good tool for the developers and getting up to speed quickly, setting up your project, but it may not be a tool or set of tools that we use moving forward.
So we did the site that you're talking about. We did 2 versions, very similar. One was not Habitat, one was your traditional kind of Sitecore project structure. The other one was Habitat. And why do you think that influenced the delivery of the project realistically? I mean, did it make it stretch out longer? Is it harder overall? And what would you what's the delta in how your DevOps ran, other than the integration from the first one to the other that you had to do?
Those are good questions. So the first question is, I think, the delta between the first project that did not use Habitat, used Glassmapper, went well. And comparing that to the second one, I think the second one actually, there was more, the perception from my perspective was that things were moving more quickly with Habitat, and that the components were coming together quicker. There was more output or effective output with Habitat than without.
Why do you think? What do you think?
I think this structure of the Habitat project lent itself well to kind of separating the concerns of our front-end devs from our back-end devs. The integration service layer was ported over, so I think that may have skewed my perception a little bit. And I think the understanding that each piece was kind of atomic in its own way lent itself well to having each component being developed in whole before moving on.
Any other questions for Ben before I let him speak?
I'm just curious, if you had a smaller atomic structure still in the field?
I would say yes, but that's just a feeling. Yeah, it's not. I don't have evidence to support that.
And as well, I think perhaps the atomic structure being helpful in this situation, especially because your team, your in-house team was doing some dev, our team was doing a little bit of dev. So the work being split up, it was easier to split it up because things were totally separate. I think that's probably some of the gains.
Absolutely.
Other questions? All right, thanks.
Thanks very much.
So yes, I'm going to run through a few more points in terms of our experience and what we got, and throughout all of this, we've only got a few more minutes, right? So throughout all of this, I'm going to look to you briefly. Nabil, anybody on the line, if you have questions. Thomas, if you want to add a comment before we end, please do so. I'll have Nabil read it. So anybody on the meetup, you can ask your questions to Nabil. He'll read them for you. And I'll look to the crowd here for your feedback as we go through each other section as we wrap up. So another thing important to those things that Ben mentioned, I think when we're doing Habitat projects, very important to do really proper code management, proper code hygiene. You're dealing with projects where hopefully you're doing features that you will reuse over and over again in different projects for different clients, and you can see how your main branch, as you do fixes or extensions, it could get kind of messy. So proper code hygiene and good DevOps and practices there is really important.
Yeah, someone is asking if there's an audio in the room. like a comment, probably that's Tom.
Oh, yeah, it'd be hot.
Unmute yourself and hopefully you
I unmute myself? Okay, I will try this.
Can you hear me?
Connection. Oh, on my laptop, of course. Okay. Let's try. I hope I can do this. And there, I've unmuted myself.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Awesome.
You can hear him? Okay. Go for it.
Well, thanks a lot, and happy to be listening in. Really good presentation, I think. You summed it up very well. The thoughts behind Habitat, and a lot of really good feedback from Razorfish on their project, I think. And I particularly want to emphasize that our aim has always been that the whole architectural principles and the guidance around it were tools agnostic. So if you look at something like Gulp, for example, Gulp was chosen for the local development optimization, which I also think was emphasized by Razorfish. In that working with a lot of projects like that, a lot of Visual Studio projects can sometimes be a little tiresome. So Gulp helps alleviate that and helps the initial setup of the local machine. And we do internally in Sitecore, when we have our build process, we have PowerShell replacing some of the tasks that are handled by Gulp. Also, if you look at the CDS project, and especially some of the developments that Hedgehog is doing on CDS, which are sort of leaning towards the Habitat principles, they will be sort of taking over a lot of the Gulp things. You can basically replace pretty much all the Gulp stuff with CDS and the tools that are in CDS.
Excellent. So while we have Thomas on the line, anybody have questions for Thomas? That would be really good to hear. Yes.
You're gonna have to repeat that. I can't hear it.
I'll repeat it for you, Thomas.
Awesome. Good.
Yeah.
I think, I think we're seeing lots of sort of co-commits in the project that are sending Habitat as a demo site, but versioning business community contributions for reusable features. Right now, I think one of the challenges that to sort of use Habitat as a template project, you have to make that separation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a comment than a question. But
Sure.
I hear what those taking on those other aspects.
Absolutely. So I'll paraphrase the question, Thomas. Basically, there was a comment that you appreciate that Habitat is not it is not an accelerator, that it's just a framework, and that it's not meant to be sort of a template for your, just pick it up and go. But there's also the complaint that it's not an accelerator in that sense. And really to kind of look to get your comments on I guess building into Habitat some things that can actually act as an accelerator, where that may go in the future. So what's your take on that?
Okay, yeah. So first of all, it was never meant as an accelerator to the community. I think you mentioned that a couple of times in your presentation. Really good. We're always emphasizing that if you want to use the Habitat code base, or you want to use some of the principles behind Habitat, what you do is you choose a point in time or one of the official releases, and then you branch out from there. And then that is your code base. Do not expect to be merging changes back in continually from the Habitat code base. we're working on this all the time, and internally in Sitecore, it's actually our foundation for all our demo sites as well, which is why you're seeing continuous commits all the time. This is our live GitHub repository for our demo sites as well. Comes back to your comment about the demo project there as well. So we have about 2 demo projects working and covering the entire sort of product suite with EXM and PXM and commerce and everything in the mix. Regarding the growing it to an accelerator, I can't really say too much, but I will say watch this space. So around the symposium time, there should be news on that. So that's about what I can say on that.
Yeah. Yeah,
and maybe it's a good time to advertise my Habitat workshop at the symposium. So if you haven't booked already, the day before the symposium there is a full day Habitat workshop. So if you want to get your fingers dirty and work with Habitat, you can sign up for that. So it's on the Wednesday, the day before the symposium.
And you'll need the full day, I think. So there's a lot to go into. So I have a question from Chris. No comment. Site coordination. Okay. Okay. Right. It doesn't have the features of a lot of non-linear and fast, but it gives you that. Right on. Yeah, so that was Chris just made a comment about site coordination and it launching just recently and being a good spot for folks to look for kind of that accelerator. With your indulgence, everybody, I'm going to just did we lose you, Thomas, or is that just
No, I'm still
okay,
here.
good. All right. Any other questions for Thomas? I mean, I'll leave him on so he can pipe in as we go through the rest here as well.
Sure.
Okay, let's continue. I'm going to leave you on, Thomas, so you can just pipe in if you like. And with your indulgence, I'll take 5 minutes just to get through the rest of the slides. That's okay with everybody? Very good. So one of the things we found, practically speaking, when we were doing the DevOps is, Ben mentioned some of those aspects of getting used to the gulp scripts. Well, it was kind of we had to get used to some of how the referencing was done as well, because you have to run scripts to import your Sitecore DLLs. So how you manage your references is going to change if you do this in the way suggested. Again, you can modify the way you do things to suit how. If you don't want to leave the way you're doing it right now, you can kind of take a hybrid approach, which we're doing with another project as well. Train your developers. Give them some time to get used to it. It takes a little bit of getting used to thinking of how you're going to name features, where you're going to put certain parts of the project. You know, am I going to put these items in the feature, or do they belong in the website? You know, where do I put the pages? And you put them in the website, in the project layer, by the way. You know, so where do I put the presentation layer, presentation details? Where do I do those things? The developers need to understand that. So you have to give them some time to get used to it. And trust me, they won't be used to it. And ultimately, there'll be a lot of stuff in the project layer where it shouldn't be. A lot of stuff, practically speaking, ends up there because I'll just put it there for now because it's fast and easy. I don't want to think about it. And it's not really, doesn't really take that much time to do it right, but it ends up there inevitably. So code review, if you can work it into your process, really important if you're going to think about doing Habitat. It's going to change somewhat about your development methodology. Now, Thomas, in the architecture stuff, references that he's made in his presentations, references some Agile books. And you don't have to be an Agile shop to use Habitat, but it kind of helps because a lot of it is tailored. It's kind of around that thinking. Having that separation of concerns and modularity works really good in that context as well. So it borrows heavily from those principles. Of course, it fits nicely into that Agile functionality, into that Agile framework, because features correspond very nicely with stories. So that kind of helps you on a number of levels. It helps you on your planning and solutioning, and we're getting into that right now. Because, oh, my battery's low too. Watch that. So we'll have to end pretty soon. It's going to adjust your architectural approach. But it's also going to push you in the direction of more feature-focused solutioning. And of course, that's going to change how you communicate things with your clients as well. So how you name your features, how you talk about your features with your clients, how you write them in your statements of work, and how you're going to deliver things. You're going to think about that. So it has influences. Your architecture influences a lot of different things. And I think it's actually a really good thing in this case, because there's been a lot of separation from what the guy quoting the job, what the BA, and what the guy developing the job have been doing. And now, if we're taking more of this approach, we're kind of unifying that so it makes sense together. The project manager, when he's talking about delivery with the guys down in the trenches building the stuff, he's talking about things that was on the SOW that the client is going to expect to see. And you can deliver that item on its own because it was a module, and you can check it off, right? And that's some of the beauties of that from a kind of a solutioning standpoint as well. So it changes how we quote on jobs. One of the important things, though, if you're going to do Habitat correctly, is to get that client buy-in. They're going to see, especially if you're taking on a project you've done already and refactoring it, there is overhead. They'll have to see the value in it. So there has to actually be value in it, and there is, in future-proofing your solution and implementing a best practice. So, and client buying is going to be extremely important in that context. In terms of this discoverability and consistency, it means something that's very important, I think, easier onboarding. Sitecore resources, and if you're running a Sitecore team, they're hard to come by, and you try to keep them, make them happy, but sometimes they're out the door. And I've seen a lot of you faces at different places. We've got some of them. We've moved a few of you around already, and that happens. That's a practical thing. But having a consistent architecture in our community means I can take you from here and put you here, and you're going to look at the code, and you'll know what's going on. So that's really good for us as a community because it means for easier onboarding. We can outsource or offshore, nearshore, or work with a partner on projects a lot easier. So I don't have capacity to meet all of these things. I can take a feature and give it to a partner to work on to meet my deadlines. The UX developers, as Ben alluded to, can work a lot easier in isolation from the back-end guys, so stepping on each other's feet a lot less. They're dealing with nice, clean, semantic HTML, and then they can do their stuff with it. So it makes things a lot easier, a lot more separated. Better practice from a separations of concern standpoint. It's certainly easier to integrate third-party modules and accelerators. And I think that means also some opportunities there. We talked about accelerators. There's opportunities, yes, for accelerators, for different modules, and more of a likelihood that you'll be able to use those things because when you take this new module, it'll fit into your architecture already because it follows that architecture. So that's really, my battery's now very low and my time is very short. So what's the future of Habitat? It's up to us. Get involved. I think Thomas needs to hear from us and how he wants to hear from us. How you want to hear from us, Thomas? You still there? He's not there.
Yes, I'm here. I was muted. Well, anyway, I mean, if you have issues with the code base or anything, put it on GitHub. If you have the Habitat Slack channel on the community Slack, Sitecore community Slack, is quite active. So that is a good way as well. If you think you have modules that would help others, then we're very interested in pull requests as well. So if you do changes that you think will benefit, then please submit them back. If it's larger modules, I would anticipate some waiting time. But if it's smaller changes, then just create a pull request on GitHub. And then I guess these kind of events, the more I listen, the more the developer team listens in on these things, the more feedback we get. So thanks a lot for that.
Excellent. So I think that's where we're going to be wrapping up. I'm over my time already. There are some Habitat resources online. I did not mention the Slack channel. These are available to you. Of course, just Google Habitat. The presentation will be there as well, though, on my site. The Twitter channel is there. Hit up Thomas on LinkedIn, bother him, and for goodness sakes, do get your feedback in there. I think it's really important, like I said, that We don't just allow this to be something that's done off in the ivory tower, but that we kind of give our feedback and we try to make it better, because ultimately it is a community endeavor. And I'm hoping that it's going to be kind of more adopted throughout the community, so that it's going to make a lot of these things easier for us as we go along. Any parting questions or comments?